"That's Ilagin's huntsman, getting up a row of some sort with our Ivan," said Nikolai's groom. Nikolai sent the groom to call his sister and Petya to come to him, and rode at a walking pace towards the spot where the whippers in were getting the hounds together. Several of the party galloped to the scene of the squabble. Nikolai dismounted, and, with Natasha and Petya, who had ridden up, he stood by the hounds, waiting to hear how the difficulty was settled. The huntsman who had been quarrelling came riding out of the bushes with a fox on the crupper, and rode towards his young master. He took off his cap a long way off, and tried as he came up to speak respectfully, but he was pale and gasping for breath, and his face was wrathful. One of his eyes was blackened, but he was probably not aware of it. "What was the matter over there?" asked Nikolai. "Why, he was going to kill the fox right under our hounds' noses. And my bitch it was, the mouse-colored one, that had got hold of it. You can go and have me up for it, snatching hold of the fox. I gave him one with the fox. Here it is on my saddle. It is a taste of this you want," said the huntsman, pointing to his hunting knife and apparently imagining that he was still talking to his enemy. Nikolai did not waste words on the man, but asking his sister and Petya to wait for him, rode over to where the hounds and the men of the enemy, Ilagin, were gathered together. The victorious huntsman rode off to join his fellows, and there, the center of a sympathetic and inquisitive crowd, he recounted his exploit. The point was that Ilagin, with whom the Rostovs had some quarrel and were engaged in a lawsuit, was hunting over places that by old custom belonged to the Rostovs, and now, as though of design, had sent his men to the ravine where the Rostovs were, and had allowed his man to snatch a fox under a stranger's dogs. Nikolai had never seen Ilagin, but he had heard of the quarrelsomeness and obstinacy of their neighbor, and rushing, as he always did, to an extreme in his judgments and feelings, he cordially detested him, and looked upon him as his bitterest foe. Excited and angry, he rode up to him now, grasping his whip in his hand, fully prepared to take the most energetic and desperate measures in dealing with the enemy. He had scarcely ridden beyond the ridge of the copse when he saw a stout gentleman in a beaver cap riding towards him on a handsome raven horse, accompanied by 2 grooms. Instead of an enemy, Nikolai found in Ilagin a courteous gentleman of imposing appearance, who was particularly anxious to make the young count's acquaintance. Ilagin took off his beaver cap as he approached Rostov, and said that he greatly regretted what had occurred, that he would have the man punished, that he begged the count to let them be better acquainted, and offered him the use of his preserves for hunting. Natasha had ridden up not far behind her brother, in some excitement, fearing he might do something awful. Seeing that the opponents were exchanging affable greetings, she rode up to them. Ilagin lifted his beaver cap higher than ever to Natasha, and, smiling agreeably, said that the countess was indeed a Diana both in her passion for the chase and her beauty, of which he had heard so much. Ilagin, to efface the impression of his huntsman's crime, insisted on Rostov coming to his upland a verst away, which he preserved for his own shooting, and described as teeming with hares. Nikolai agreed, and the whole party, its numbers now doubled, moved on. They had to ride through the fields to get there. The huntsmen moved in a line, and the gentry rode together. The uncle, Rostov, and Ilagin glanced stealthily at each other's dogs, trying not to be observed by the others, and looking uneasily for rivals likely to excel their own dogs. Rostov was particularly struck by the beauty of a small thoroughbred, slender, black and tan bitch of Ilagin's, with muscles like steel, a delicate nose, and prominent black eyes. He had heard of the sporting qualities of Ilagin's dogs, and in that handsome bitch he saw a rival of his Milka. In the middle of a sedate conversation about the crops of the year, started by Ilagin, Nikolai pointed out the black and tan bitch. "You have a fine bitch there," he said in a careless tone. "Is she clever?" "That one? Yes, she's a good beast. She can catch a hare. Ilagin said indifferently of his black and tan Yertsa, a bitch for whom he had a year before given a neighbor 3 families of house serfs. "So they don't brag of their thrashing, Count," he went on, taking up their previous conversation. And feeling it only polite to repay the young Count's compliment, Ilagin scanned his dogs, and pitched on Milka, whose broad back caught his eye. "That's a good black and tan you have there, a fine one," he said. "Yes, she's all right, she can run," answered Nikolai. "Oh, if only a good big hare would run into the field, I would show you what she's like," he thought, and turning to his groom, he said he would give a rouble to anyone who would unearth a hare. "I can't understand," Ilagin went on, "how it is other sportsmen are so envious over game and dogs. I will tell you for myself, Count. I enjoy hunting, as you know. The chase in such company, what could be more delightful?" He doffed his beaver cap again to Natasha. "But this reckoning up of the skins one has carried off, I don't care about that." "Oh, no." "Nor could I be chagrined at my dogs being outdone by another man's. All I care about is the chase itself, Count? And so I consider—" "Oh, ho, ho!" sounded at that moment in a prolonged call from one of the grooms. He was standing on a knoll in the stubble with his whip held up, and he called once more, "Oh, ho, aho!" This call and the lifted whip meant that he saw a hare squatting before him. "Ah, he has started a hare, I fancy," said Ilagin carelessly. "Well, let us course it, Count." "Yes, we must. But what do you say, together?" answered Nikolai, looking intently at Yertsa and the uncle's red Rugai, the 2 rivals against whom he had never before had the chance of putting his dogs. "What if they outdo my Milka from the first?" he thought, riding by the uncle and Ilagin towards the hare. "Is it full grown?" asked Ilagin, going up to the groom who had started it, and looking about him with some excitement as he whistled to his Yertsa. "And you, Mikhail Nikanorich," he said to the uncle. The uncle rode on, looking sullen. "What's the use of my competing with you? Why, your dogs, you have paid a village for each of them. They're worth thousands. You try yours against each other, and I'll look on." "Rugai! Hey, hey!" he shouted. "Rugayushka!" he added, involuntarily expressing his tenderness, and the hope he put in the red dog by this affectionate diminutive. Natasha saw and felt the emotion concealed by the 2 elderly men and by her brother, and was herself excited by it. The groom on the knoll was standing with his whip lifted. The gentleman rode up to him at a walking pace. The pack were on the rim of the horizon, moving away from the hare. The rest of the hunting party, too, were riding away. Everything was done slowly and deliberately. "Which way is its head?" asked Nikolai, after riding 100 paces towards the groom. But before the groom had time to answer, the hare, who had been sniffing in the ground the frost coming next morning, leaped up from its squatting posture. The pack of hounds on leashes flew baying downhill after the hare. The harriers, who were not on leash, rushed from all sides towards the hounds or after the hare. The whippers-in, who had been moving so deliberately, galloped over the country, getting the dogs together, with shouts of "Stop!" while the huntsmen directed their course with shouts of "Oh! Oh! Ahoy!" Nikolai, Natasha, and the uncle and Ilagin, who had been hitherto so composed, flew ahead, reckless of how or where they went, seeing nothing but the dogs and the hare, and afraid of nothing but losing sight for an instant of the course. The hare turned out to be a fleet and strong one. When he jumped up, he did not at once race off, but cocked up his ears, listening to the shouts and tramp of hoofs, which came from all sides at once. He took a dozen bounds not very swiftly, letting the dogs gain on him, but at last, choosing his direction and grasping his danger, he put his ears back and dashed off at full speed. He had been crouching in the stubble, but the green field was in front of him, and there it was marshy ground. The 2 dogs of the groom who had started him were the nearest, and the first to be on the scent after him. But they had not got near him when Ilagin's black and tan Yerza flew ahead of them, got within a yard, pounced on him with fearful swiftness, aiming at the hare's tail, and rolled over, thinking she had hold of him. The hare arched his back, and bounded off more nimbly than ever. The broad-backed black and tan Milka flew ahead of Yerza, and began rapidly gaining on the hare. "Milashka! Little mother!" Nikolai shouted triumphantly. Milka seemed on the point of pouncing on the hare, but she overtook him and flew beyond. The hare doubled back. Again the graceful Yerza dashed at him, and kept close to the hare's tail, as though measuring the distance, so as not to miss getting hold of the hare by the haunch this time. "Yerzinka, little sister!" wailed Ilagin, in a voice unlike his own. Yerza did not heed his appeals. At the very moment when she seemed about to seize the hare, he doubled and darted away to the ditch between the stubble and the green field. Again Yerza and Milka, running side by side like a pair of horses, flew after the hare. The hare was better off in the ditch. The dogs could not gain on him so quickly. "Rugai! Rugayushka! Forward, quick march!" Another voice shouted this time, and Rugai, the uncle's red, broad-shouldered dog, stretching out and curving his back, caught up the 2 foremost dogs, pushed ahead of them, flung himself with complete self-abandonment right on the hare, turned him out of the ditch into the green field, flung himself still more viciously on him once more, sinking up to his knees in the swampy ground, and all that could be seen was the dog rolling over with the hare, covering his back with mud. The dogs formed a star-shaped figure round him. A moment later all the party pulled their horses up round the crowding dogs. The uncle alone dismounted in a rapture of delight, and cutting off the feet, shaking the hare for the blood to drip off, he looked about him, his eyes restless with excitement, and his hands and legs moving nervously. He went on talking, regardless of what or to whom he spoke. "There's something like. Quick march! There's a dog for you. He outstripped them all. If they cost 1,000 or they cost a ruble, forward, quick march, and no mistake," he kept saying, panting and looking wrathfully about him, as though he were abusing someone, as though they had all been his enemies, had insulted him, and he had only now at last succeeded in paying them out. "So much for your 1,000-ruble dogs. Forward, quick march! Rugai, here's the foot," he said, dropping the dog the hare's muddy foot, which he had just cut off. "You've deserved it. Forward, quick march!" She wore herself out, ran it down 3 times all alone, Nikolai was saying, listening to no one, and heedless whether he were heard or not. "To be sure, cutting in sideways like that," Ilagin's groom was saying. "Why, when it had been missed like that and once down, any yard dog could catch it, of course," said Ilagin at the same moment, red and breathless from the gallop and the excitement. At the same time, Natasha, without taking breath, gave vent to her delight and excitement in a shriek so shrill that it set everyone's ears tingling. In that shriek she expressed just what the others were expressing by talking all at once. And her shriek was so strange that she must have been ashamed of that wild scream, and the others must have been surprised at it at any other time. The uncle himself twisted up the hare, flung him neatly and smartly across his horse's back, seeming to reproach them all by this gesture, and with an air of not caring to speak to anyone, he mounted his bay and rode away. All but he, dispirited and disappointed, rode on, and it was some time before they could recover their previous affectation of indifference. For a long time after, they stared at the red dog, Rugai, who with his round back spattered with mud, and clinking the rings of his leash, walked with the serene air of a conqueror behind the uncle's horse, I'm like all the rest, till it's a question of coursing a hare, but then you had better look out," was what Nikolai fancied the dog's air expressed. When the uncle rode up to Nikolai a good deal later, and addressed a remark to him, he felt flattered at the uncle's deigning to speak to him after what had happened. Chapter 7. When Ilagin took leave of them in the evening, Nikolai found himself so great a distance from home that he accepted the uncle's invitation to stop hunting and to stay the night at the uncle's little place, Mihailovka.
"And if you all come to me, forward, quick march," said the uncle, "it would be even better. You see, the weather's damp, you could rest, and the little countess could be driven back in a trap."
The invitation was accepted. A huntsman was sent to Otradnoy for a trap, and Nikolai, Natasha, and Petya rode to the uncle's house. 5 men servants, little and big, ran out onto the front steps to meet their master. Dozens of women, old and big and little, popped out at the back entrance to have a look at the huntsmen as they arrived. The presence of Natasha, a woman, a lady, on horseback, excited the curiosity of the uncle's house serfs to such a pitch that many of them went up to her, stared her in the face, and, unrestrained by her presence, made remarks about her, as though she were some prodigy on show, not a human being, and not capable of hearing and understanding what was said about her. "Arinka, look'ee, she sits sideways, sits on so, while her skirt flies about. And look at the little horn. Sakes alive, and the knife too. A regular Tatar woman. How do you manage not to tumble off?" said the forwardest of them, addressing Natasha boldly. The uncle got off his horse at the steps of his little wooden house, which was shut in by an overgrown garden. Looking from one to another of his household, he shouted peremptorily to those who were not wanted to retire, and for the others to do all that was needed for the reception of his guests. They all ran off in different directions. The uncle helped Natasha to dismount, and gave her his arm up the shaky plank steps. Inside, the house, with boarded, unplastered walls, was not very clean. There was nothing to show that the chief aim of the persons living in it was the removal of every spot, yet there were not signs of neglect. There was a smell of fresh apples in the entry, and the walls were hung with fox skins and wolf skins. The uncle led his guests through the vestibule into a little hall with a folding table and red chairs, then into a drawing-room with a round birchwood table and a sofa, and then into his study, with a ragged sofa, a threadbare carpet, and portraits of Suvorov, of his mother and father, and of himself in military uniform. The study smelt strongly of tobacco and dogs. In the study, the uncle asked his guests to sit down and make themselves at home, and he left them. Rugai came in, his back still covered with mud, and lay on the sofa, cleaning himself with his tongue and his teeth. There was a corridor leading from the study, and in it they could see a screen with ragged curtains. Behind the screen they heard feminine laughter and whispering. Natasha, Nikolai, and Petya took off their wraps and sat down on the sofa. Petya leaned on his arm and fell asleep at once. Natasha and Nikolai sat without speaking. Their faces were burning. They were very hungry and very cheerful. They looked at one another. Now that the hunt was over and they were indoors, Nikolai did not feel called upon to show his masculine superiority over his sister. Natasha winked at her brother, and they could neither of them restrain themselves long, and broke into a ringing laugh before they had time to invent a pretext for their mirth. After a brief interval, the uncle came in wearing a Cossack coat, blue breeches, and little top boots. And this very costume, at which Natasha had looked with surprise and amusement when the uncle wore it at Otradnoy, seemed to her now the right costume here, and in no way inferior to frock coats or ordinary jackets. The uncle, too, was in good spirits. far from feeling mortified at the laughter of the brother and sister, he was incapable of imagining that they could be laughing at his mode of life. He joined in their causeless mirth himself.
"Well, this young countess here, forward, quick march! I have never seen her like,"
he said, giving a long pipe to Rostov, while with a practised motion of 3 fingers he filled another, a short broken one, for himself.
"She's been in the saddle all day, something for a man to boast of, and she's just as fresh as if nothing had happened."
Soon the door was opened obviously, from the sound, by a barefoot servant girl, and a stout, red-cheeked, handsome woman of about 40, with a double chin and full red lips, walked in, with a big tray in her hands. With hospitable dignity and cordiality in her eyes and in every gesture, she looked round at the guests, and with a genial smile bowed to them respectfully. In spite of her exceptional stoutness, which made her hold her head flung back, while her bosom and all her portly person was thrust forward, this woman, the uncle's housekeeper, stepped with extreme lightness. She went to the table, put the tray down, and deftly, with her plump white hands, set the bottles and dishes on the table. When she had finished this task, she went away, standing for a moment in the doorway with a smile on her face. "Here I am. I am she. Now do you understand the uncle?" her appearance had said to Rostov. Who could fail to understand? Not Nikolai only, but even Natasha understood the uncle now, and the significance of his knitted brows, and the happy, complacent smile which puckered his lips as Anisia Fyodorovna came in. On the tray there were liqueurs, herb brandy, mushrooms, biscuits of rye flour made with buttermilk, honey in the comb, foaming mead made from honey, apples, nuts raw and nuts baked, and nuts preserved in honey. Then Anisia Fyodorovna brought in preserves made with honey and with sugar, and ham, and a chicken that had just been roasted. All these delicacies were of Anisia Fyodorovna's preparing, cooking, or preserving. All seemed to smell and taste, as it were, of Anisia Fyodorovna. All seemed to recall her buxomness, cleanliness, whiteness, and cordial smile. "A little of this, please, little countess," she kept saying, as she handed Natasha first one thing, then another. Natasha ate of everything, and it seemed to her that such buttermilk biscuits, such delicious preserves, such nuts in honey, such a chicken, she had never seen nor tasted anywhere. Anisia Fyodorovna withdrew. Rostov and the uncle, as they sipped cherry brandy after supper, talked of hunts past and to come, of Rugai and Ilagin's dogs. Natasha sat upright on the sofa, listening with sparkling eyes. She tried several times to waken Petya and make him eat something, but he made incoherent replies, evidently in his sleep. Natasha felt so gay, so well content in these new surroundings, that her only fear was that the trap would come too soon for her. After a silence had chanced to fall upon them, as almost always happens when anyone receives friends for the first time in his own house, the uncle said, in response to the thought in his guests' minds, "Yes, so you see how I am finishing my days. One dies, forward, quick march, nothing is left, so why sin?" The uncle's face was full of significance, and even beauty, as he said this. Rostov could not help recalling, as he spoke, all the good things he had heard said by his father and the neighbors about him. Through the whole district the uncle had the reputation of being a most generous and disinterested eccentric. He was asked to arbitrate in family quarrels. He was chosen executor. Secrets were entrusted to him. He was elected a justice and asked to fill other similar posts. But he had always persisted in refusing all public appointments, spending the autumn and spring in the fields on his bay horse, the winter sitting at home, and the summer lying in his overgrown garden. "Why don't you enter the service, uncle?"
"I have been in the service, but I flung it up. I'm not fit for it. I can't make anything of it. That's your affair. I haven't the wit for it. The chase now is a very different matter. There it's all forward and quick march. Open the door there," he shouted. "Why have you shut it?"
A door at the end of the corridor, which word the uncle always pronounced "collador," like a peasant, led to the huntsman's room, as the sitting-room for the huntsman was called. There was a rapid patter of bare feet, and an unseen hand opened the door into the huntsman's room. They could then hear distinctly from the corridor the sounds of a balalaika, unmistakably played by a master hand. Natasha had been for some time listening, and now she went out into the corridor to hear the music more clearly.
"That's Mitka, my coachman. I bought him a good balalaika. I'm fond of it,"
said the uncle. It was his custom to get Mitka to play the balalaika in the men's room when he came home from the chase. He was fond of hearing that instrument. "How well he plays! It's really very nice," said Nikolai, with a certain unconscious superciliousness in his tone, as though he were ashamed to admit he liked this music. "Very nice," Natasha said reproachfully, feeling the tone in which her brother had spoken. "It's not nice, but splendid, really." Just as the uncle's mushrooms and honey and liqueurs had seemed to her the most delicious in the world, this playing struck her at that moment as the very acme of musical expression. "More, please," said Natasha in the doorway, as soon as the balalaika ceased. Mitka tuned up, and began again gallantly twanging away at "My Lady," with shakes and flourishes. The uncle sat listening with his head on one side, and a slight smile. The air of "My Lady" was repeated 100 times over. Several times the balalaika was tuned up, and the same notes were thrummed again, but the audience did not weary of it, and still longed to hear it again and again. Anisia Fyodorovna came in and stood with her portly person leaning against the door-post. "You are pleased to listen," she said to Natasha, with a smile extraordinarily like the uncle's smile. "He does play nicely," she said.
"That part he never plays right," the uncle said suddenly with a vigorous gesture. "It ought to be taken more at a run. Forward, quick march! To be played lightly."
"Why, can you do it?" asked Natasha. The uncle smiled and did not answer.
"Just you look, Anisiushka, whether the strings are all right on the guitar, eh? It's a long while since I have handled it. I had quite given it up."
Anisia Fyodorovna went very readily with her light step to do her master's bidding, and brought him his guitar. Without looking at anyone, the uncle blew the dust off it, tapped on the case with his bony fingers, tuned it, and settled himself in a low chair. Arching his left elbow with a rather theatrical gesture, he held the guitar above the fingerboard, and winking at Anisia Fyodorovna, he played, not the first notes of "My Lady," but a single, pure musical chord, and then smoothly, quietly, but confidently, began playing in very slow time the well-known song, "As Along the High Road." The air of the song thrilled in Nikolai's and Natasha's hearts in time, in tune with it, with the same sober gaiety. The same gaiety as was manifest in the whole personality of Anisia Fyodorovna. Anisia Fyodorovna flushed, and hiding her face in her kerchief, went laughing out of the room. The uncle still went on playing the song carefully, correctly, and vigorously, gazing with a transformed, inspired face at the spot where Anisia Fyodorovna had stood. Laughter came gradually into his face on one side under his grey moustache, and it grew stronger as the song went on, as the time quickened, and breaks came after a flourish. "Splendid, splendid, uncle! Again, again!" cried Natasha, as soon as he had finished. She jumped up from her place, and kissed and hugged the uncle. "Nikolenka, Nikolenka," she said, looking round at her brother as though to ask, "What do you say to it?" Nikolai, too, was much pleased by the uncle's playing. He played the song a second time. The smiling face of Anisia Fyodorovna appeared again in the doorway, and other faces behind her. "For the water from the well, a maiden calls to him to stay," played the uncle. He made another dexterous flourish and broke off, twitching his shoulders. "Oh, oh, uncle darling," wailed Natasha, in a voice as imploring as though her life depended on it. The uncle got up, and there seemed to be two men in him at that moment. One smiled seriously at the antics of the merry player, while the merry player naively and carefully executed the steps preliminary to the dance. "Come, little niece," cried the uncle, waving to Natasha the hand that had struck the last chord. Natasha flung off the shawl that had been wrapped round her, ran forward facing the uncle, and setting her arms akimbo, made the movements of her shoulder and waist. Where, how, when, had this young countess, educated by a French émigré, sucked in with the Russian air she breathed the spirit of that dance? Where had she picked up these movements, which the pas de châle would, one might have thought, long ago have eradicated? But the spirit, the motions were those inimitable, unteachable, Russian gestures the uncle had hoped for from her. As soon as she stood up and smiled that triumphant, proud smile of sly gaiety, the dread that had come on Nikolai and all the spectators at the first moment, the dread that she would not dance it well, was at an end, and they were already admiring her. She danced the dance well, so well indeed, so perfectly, that Anisia Fyodorovna, who handed her at once the kerchief she needed in the dance, had tears in her eyes, though she laughed as she watched that slender, graceful little countess, reared in silk and velvet, belonging to another world than hers, who was yet able to understand all that was in Anisia, and her father, and her mother, and her aunt, and every Russian soul. "Well done, little countess! Forward, quick march!" cried the uncle, laughing gleefully as he finished the dance. "Ah, that's a niece to be proud of. She only wants a fine fellow picked out now for her husband, and then forward, quick march!" "One has been picked out already," said Nikolai, smiling. "Oh!" said the uncle in surprise, looking inquiringly at Natasha. Natasha nodded her head with a happy smile. "And such an one," she said. But as soon as she said it, a different, new series of ideas and feelings rose up within her. What was the meaning of Nikolai's smile when he said, "One has been picked out already"? Was he glad of it, or not glad? He seemed to think my Bolkonsky would not approve, would not understand our gaiety now. No, he would quite understand it. Where is he now? Natasha wondered, and her face became serious at once. But that lasted only 1 second. I mustn't think. I mustn't dare to think about that, she said to herself, and smiling, she sat down again near the uncle, begging him to play them something more. The uncle played another song and waltz. Then, after a pause, he cleared his throat and began to sing his favorite hunting song. "When there fall at evening glow the first flakes of winter snow." The uncle sang, as peasants sing, in full and naive conviction that in a song the whole value rests in the words, that the tune comes of itself, and that a tune apart is nothing, that the tune is only for the sake of the verse. And this gave the uncle's unself-conscious singing a peculiar charm, like the song of birds. Natasha was in ecstasies over the uncle's singing. She made up her mind not to learn the harp any longer, but to play only on the guitar. She asked the uncle for the guitar and at once struck the chords of the song. At 10 o'clock there arrived the wagonette, a trap, and 3 men on horseback, who had been sent to look for Natasha and Petya. The Count and Countess did not know where they were, and were very anxious, so said one of the men. Petya was carried out and laid in the wagonette as though he had been a corpse. Natasha and Nikolai got into the trap. The uncle wrapped Natasha up, and said good-bye to her with quite a new tenderness. He accompanied them on foot as far as the ridge which they had to ride round, fording the stream, and bade his huntsmen ride in front with lanterns. "Farewell, dear little niece," they heard called in the darkness by his voice, not the one Natasha had been familiar with before, but the voice that had sung, "When fall at evening glow." There were red lights in the village they drove through, and a cheerful smell of smoke. "What a darling that uncle is," said Natasha, as they drove out into the high road. "Yes," said Nikolai. "You're not cold?" "No, I'm very comfortable, very. I am so happy," said Natasha, positively perplexed at her own well-being. They were silent for a long while. The night was dark and damp. They could not see the horses, but could only hear them splashing through the unseen mud. What was passing in that childlike, responsive soul, that so eagerly caught and made its own all the varied impressions of life? How were they all stored away in her heart? But she was very happy. They were getting near home, when she suddenly hummed the air of "When fall at evening glow," which she had been trying to get all the way, and had only just succeeded in catching. "Have you caught it?" said Nikolai. "What are you thinking of just now, Nikolai?" asked Natasha. They were fond of asking each other that question. "I?" said Nikolai, trying to recall. "Well, you see, at first I was thinking that Rugai, the red dog, is like the uncle, and that if he were a man, he would keep uncle always in the house with him, if not for racing. For music he'd keep him anyway. How jolly uncle is, isn't he?" "Well, and you?" "I? Wait a minute. Oh, I was thinking at first that here we are driving and supposing that we are going home, but God knows where we are going in this darkness, and all of a sudden we shall arrive and see we are not at Otradnoy, but in fairyland. And then I thought, too—" "No, nothing more." "I know, of course. You thought of him," said Nikolai, smiling, as Natasha could tell by his voice. "No," Natasha answered, though she really had been thinking at the same time of Prince Andrei, and how he would like the uncle. "And I keep repeating, too, all the way I keep repeating, how nicely Anisyushka walked. How nicely," said Natasha, and Nikolai heard her musical, causeless, happy laugh. "And do you know," she said suddenly, "I know I shall never be as happy, as peaceful as I am now." "What nonsense! Idiocy! Rubbish!" said Nikolai, and he thought, "What a darling this Natasha of mine is! I have never had, and never shall have, another friend like her. Why should she be married? I could drive like this with her forever. What a darling this Nikolai of mine is," Natasha was thinking. "Ah, still a light in the drawing-room," she said, pointing to the windows of their house gleaming attractively in the wet, velvety darkness of the night. Chapter 8. Count Ilya Andreich had given up being a marshal of nobility because that position involved too heavy an expenditure, but his difficulties were not removed by that. Often Natasha and Nikolai knew of uneasy, private consultations between their parents, and heard talk of selling the sumptuous ancestral house of the Rostovs and the estate near Moscow. When the Count was no longer marshal, it was not necessary to entertain on such a large scale, and they led a quieter life at Otradnoy than in former years. But the immense house and the lodges were still full of people. More than 20 persons still sat down to table with them. These were all their own people, time-honored inmates of their household, almost members of the family, or persons who must, it seemed, inevitably live in the Count's house. Such were Dimmler, the music-master, and his wife, Vogel the dancing-master with his family, and old Madame Bialov, and many others besides, Petya's tutors, the girl's old governess, and persons who simply found it better, or more profitable, to live at the Count's than in a house of their own. They did not entertain so many guests as before, But they still lived in that manner, apart from which the Count and Countess could not have conceived of life at all. There was still the same hunting establishment, increased indeed by Nikolai. There were still the same 50 horses and 15 grooms in the stables, the same costly presents on name days, and ceremonial dinners to the whole neighborhood. There were still the Count's games of whist and Boston, at which, letting every one see his cards, he allowed himself to be plundered every day of hundreds by his neighbors, who looked upon the privilege of making up a rubber with Count Ilya Andreitch as a profitable investment. The Count went into his affairs as though walking into a huge net, trying not to believe that he was entangled, and at every step getting more and more entangled, and feeling too feeble either to tear the nets that held him fast, or with care and patience to set about disentangling them. The Countess, with her loving heart, felt that her children were being ruined, that the Count was not to blame, that he could not help being what he was, that he was distressed himself, though he tried to conceal it, at the consciousness of his own and his children's ruin, and was seeking means to improve their position. To her feminine mind only one way of doing so occurred. That was, to marry Nikolai to a wealthy heiress. She felt that this was their last hope, and that if Nikolai were to refuse the match she had found for him, she must bid farewell forever to all chance of improving their position. This match was Julie Karagin, the daughter of excellent and virtuous parents, known to the Rostovs from childhood, and now left a wealthy heiress by the death of her last surviving brother. The Countess wrote directly to Madame Karagin in Moscow, suggesting to her the marriage of her daughter to her own son, and received a favorable reply from her. Madame Karagin replied that she was quite ready for her part to consent to the match, but everything must depend on her daughter's inclinations. Madame Karagin invited Nikolai to come to Moscow. Several times the Countess, with tears in her eyes, had told her son that now that both her daughters were settled, her only wish was to see him married. She said that she could rest quietly in her grave if this were settled. Then she would say that she had an excellent girl in her eye, and would try and get from him his views on matrimony. On other occasions she praised Julie, and advised Nikolai to go to Moscow for the holidays to amuse himself a little. Nikolai guessed what his mother's hints were aiming at, and on one such occasion he forced her to complete frankness. She told him plainly that all hope of improving their position rested now on his marrying Julie Karagin. "What? If I loved a girl with no fortune, would you really desire me, mamma, to sacrifice my feeling and my honor for the sake of money?" he asked his mother, with no notion of the cruelty of his question, but simply wishing to show his noble sentiments. "No, you misunderstand me," said his mother, not knowing how to retrieve her mistake. "You misunderstand me, Nikolenka. It is your happiness I wish for," she added, and she felt she was speaking falsely, that she was blundering. She burst into tears. "Mamma, don't cry, and only tell me that you wish it, and you know that I would give my whole life, everything, for your peace of mind," said Nikolai. "I will sacrifice everything for you, even my feelings." But the Countess did not want the question put like that. She did not want to receive sacrifices from her son. She would have liked to sacrifice herself to him. "No, you don't understand me. Don't let us talk of it," she said, wiping away her tears. "No, you don't understand me. Don't let us talk of it," she said, wiping away her tears. "Yes, perhaps I really do love a poor girl," Nikolai said to himself. "What? Am I to sacrifice my feeling and my honor for fortune? I wonder how Mamma could say such a thing. Because Sonia is poor, I must not love her," he thought. "I must not respond to her faithful, devoted love. And it is certain I should be happier with her than with any doll of a Julie. To sacrifice my feelings for the welfare of my family I can always do," he said to himself, "but I can't control my feelings. If I love Sonia, That feeling is more than anything and above anything for me. Nikolai did not go to Moscow. The Countess did not renew her conversations with him about matrimony, and with grief, and sometimes with exasperation, saw symptoms of a growing attachment between her son and the portionless Sonia. She blamed herself for it, yet could not refrain from scolding and upbraiding Sonia, often reproving her without cause, and addressing her as "my good girl." What irritated the kind-hearted Countess more than anything was that this poor, dark-eyed niece was so meek, so good, so devoutly grateful to her benefactors, and so truly, so constantly, and so unselfishly in love with Nikolai, that it was impossible to find any fault with her. Nikolai went on spending his term of leave with his parents. From Prince Andrei a fourth letter had been received from Rome. In it he wrote that he would long ago have been on his way back to Russia, but that in the warm climate his wound had suddenly reopened, which would compel him to defer his return till the beginning of the new year. Natasha was as much in love with her betrothed, as untroubled in her love, and as ready to throw herself into all the pleasures of life as ever. But towards the end of the 4th month of their separation, she began to suffer from fits of depression, against which she was unable to contend. She felt sorry for herself, sorry that all this time should be wasted and be of no use to anyone, while she felt such capacity for loving and being loved. Life was not gay in the Rostovs' household. Chapter 9. Christmas came, and except for the High Mass, the solemn and wearisome congratulations to neighbors and house serfs, and the new gowns donned by everyone, nothing special happened to mark the holidays, though the still weather, with 20 degrees of frost, the dazzling sunshine by day, and the bright, starlit sky at night, seemed to call for some special celebration of the season. On the 3rd day of Christmas week, after dinner, all the members of the household had separated and gone to their respective rooms. It was the dullest time of the day. Nikolai, who had been calling on neighbors in the morning, was asleep in the divan room. The old Count was resting in his own room. In the drawing-room, Sonia was sitting at a round table, copying a design for embroidery. The Countess was playing Patience. Nastasia Ivanovna, the buffoon, with the dejected countenance, was sitting in the window with 2 old ladies. Natasha came into the room, went up to Sonia, looked at what she was doing, then went up to her mother, and stood there mutely. "Why are you wandering about like an unquiet spirit?" said her mother. "What do you want?" "I want him. I want him at once, this minute," said Natasha, with a gleam in her eyes and no smile on her lips. The Countess raised her head and looked intently at her daughter. "Don't look at me, Mamma. Don't look at me like that. I shall cry in a minute." "Sit down. Come and sit by me," said the Countess. "Mamma, I want him. Why should I be wasting time like this, Mamma?" Her voice broke, tears gushed into her eyes, and, to hide them, she turned quickly and went out of the room. She went into the divan room, stood there, thought a moment, and went to the maid's room. There an old maidservant was scolding a young girl who had run in breathless from the cold outside. "Give over playing," said the old woman. "There is a time for everything." "Let her off, Kondratyevna," said Natasha. "Run along, Mavrusha, run along." After releasing Mavrusha, Natasha crossed the big hall and went to the vestibule. An old footman and 2 young ones were playing cards. They broke off and rose at the entrance of their young mistress. "What am I to do with them?" Natasha wondered. "Yes, Nikita, go out, please." "Where am I to send him?" "Yes, go to the yard and bring me a cock, please. And you, Misha, bring me some oats." "Just a few oats, if you please," said Misha, with cheerful readiness. "Run along, make haste," the old man urged him. "Fyodor, you get me some chalk." As she passed the buffet, she ordered the samovar, though it was not the right time for it. The buffet waiter, Foka, was the most ill-tempered person in the house. Natasha liked to try her power over him. He did not believe in her order, and went to inquire if it were really wanted. "Ah, you're a nice young lady," said Foka, pretending to frown at Natasha. No one in the house sent people on errands and gave the servants so much work as Natasha. She could not see people without wanting to send them for something. She seemed to be trying to see whether one of them would not be cross or sulky with her. But no one's orders were so readily obeyed by the servants as Natasha's. "What am I to do? Where am I to go?" Natasha wondered, strolling slowly along the corridor. "Nastasia Ivanovna, what will my children be?" she asked the buffoon, who came towards her in his woman's jacket. "Fleas and dragonflies and grasshoppers," answered the buffoon. My God, always the same. Oh, where am I to go? What am I to do with myself?" And she ran rapidly upstairs, tapping with her shoes, to see Vogel and his wife, who had rooms on the top floor. The two governesses were sitting with the Vogels, and on the table were plates of raisins, walnuts, and almonds. The governesses were discussing the question which was the cheaper town to live in, Moscow or Odessa. Natasha sat down, listened to their talk with a serious and dreamy face, and got up. "The island of Madagascar," she said. "Mada-ga-scar," she repeated, articulating each syllable distinctly, and making no reply to Madame Schoss's inquiry into her meaning, she went out of the room. Petya, her brother, was upstairs too. He was engaged with his tutor, making fireworks to let off that night. "Petya! Petya!" she shouted to him. "Carry me downstairs." Petya ran to her and offered her his back, and he pranced along with her. "No, enough. The island Madagascar," she repeated, and jumping off his back, she went downstairs. Having as it were reviewed her kingdom, tried her power, and made sure that all were submissive, but yet that she was dull, Natasha went into the big hall, took up the guitar, and sat down with it in a dark corner behind a bookcase. She began fingering the strings in the bass, picking out a phrase she recalled from an opera she had heard in Petersburg with Prince Andrei. For other listeners, the sounds that came from her guitar would have had no sort of meaning, but these sounds called up in her imagination a whole series of reminiscences. She sat behind the bookcase, with her eyes fixed on a streak of light that fell from the crack in the pantry door, and listened to herself and recalled the past. She was in the mood for brooding over memories. Sonia crossed the hall and went into the pantry with a glass in her hand. Natasha glanced at her through the crack in the pantry door, and it seemed to her that she remembered the light falling through the crack in the pantry door, and Sonia passing with a glass in just the same way. Yes, and it was exactly the same in every detail, thought Natasha. "Sonia, what is this?" called Natasha, twanging the thick cord with her fingers. "Oh, are you there?" said Sonia, starting, and she came up and listened. "I don't know." "A storm?" she said timidly, afraid of being wrong. "Why, she started in just the same way, and came up and smiled the same timid smile when it all happened before," thought Natasha, "and just in the same way, too. I thought there was something wanting in her." "No, it's the chorus from the water carrier. Listen," and Natasha hummed the air of the chorus so that Sonia might catch it. "Where were you going?" asked Natasha. "To change the water in my glass. I am just finishing coloring the design." "You always find something to do, but I can't, you know," said Natasha. "And where's Nikolenka?" "I think he's asleep." "Sonia, do go and wake him," said Natasha. "Tell him I want him to sing with me." She sat a little longer, pondering on what was the meaning of its all having happened before, and not solving that question, and not in the least chagrined at being unable to do so. She passed again in her imagination to the time when she was with him, and he gazed at her with eyes of love. "Oh, if he would come quickly! I'm so afraid it will never come. And worst of all, I'm getting older, that's the thing. There won't be in me what there is in me now. Perhaps he is coming today. We'll be here immediately. Perhaps he has come, and is sitting there in the drawing-room. Perhaps he did come yesterday, and I have forgotten." She got up, put down her guitar, and went into the parlor. All their domestic circle, tutors, governesses, and guests, were sitting at the tea-table. The servants were standing round the table. But Prince Andrei was not there, and the same old life was still going on.
"Here she is,"
said the Count, seeing Natasha coming in.
"Come, sit by me."
But Natasha stayed by her mother, looking about her as though seeking for something. "Mamma," she said, "give me him. Give me him, Mamma, quickly, quickly." And again she could hardly suppress her sobs. She sat down to the table and listened to the talk of the elders and Nikolai, who had come in to tea. My God, the same people, the same talk, Papa holding his cup and blowing it just the same as always, thought Natasha, feeling with horror an aversion rising up in her for all her family, because they were always the same. After tea, Nikolai, Sonia, and Natasha went into the divan-room to their favorite corner, where their most intimate talks always began. Chapter 10. "Does it happen to you," said Natasha to her brother, when they were settled in the divan-room, "to feel that nothing will ever happen? Nothing? That all that is good is past? And it's not exactly a bored feeling, but melancholy?" "I should think so," he said. "It has sometimes happened to me that when everything's all right and everyone's cheerful, it suddenly strikes one that one's sick of it all, and all must die. Once in the regiment, when I did not go to some merry-making, and there the music was playing, and I felt all at once so dreary." "Oh, I know that feeling. I know it, Natasha assented. "Even when I was quite little, I used to have that feeling. Do you remember, once I was punished for eating some plums, and you were all dancing, and I sat in the schoolroom sobbing? I shall never forget it. I felt sad and sorry for everyone, sorry for myself, and for everyone. And what was the chief point, I wasn't to blame," said Natasha. "Do you remember?" "I remember," said Nikolai. "I remember that I came to you afterwards, and I longed to comfort you. But you know, I felt ashamed to. Awfully funny we used to be. I had a wooden doll then, and I wanted to give it you. Do you remember?" "And do you remember," said Natasha, with a pensive smile, "how long, long ago, when we were quite little, Uncle called us into the study in the old house, and it was dark. We went in, and all at once there stood—" "A Negro." Nikolai finished her sentence with a smile of delight. "Of course I remember. To this day I don't know whether there really was a Negro, or whether we dreamed it, or were told about it. He was gray-headed, do you remember, and had white teeth. He stood and looked at us." "Do you remember, Sonia?" asked Nikolai. Yes, I do remember something too," Sonia answered timidly. "You know, I have often asked both Papa and Mamma about that Negro," said Natasha. "They say there never was a Negro at all. But you remember him?" "Of course I do. I remember his teeth as if it were today." "How strange it is, as though it were a dream. I like that." "And do you remember how we were rolling eggs in the big hall, and all of a sudden 2 old women came in and began whirling round on the carpet? Did that happen or not? Do you remember what fun it was?" "Yes. And do you remember how Papa in a blue coat fired a gun off on the steps?" Smiling with enjoyment, they went through their reminiscences, not the melancholy memories of old age, but the romantic memories of youth. Those impressions of the remotest past, in which dreamland melts into reality. They laughed with quiet pleasure. Sonia was, as always, left behind by them, though their past had been spent together. Sonia did not remember much of what they recalled, and what she did remember did not rouse the same romantic feeling in her. She was simply enjoying their pleasure and trying to share it. She could only enter into it fully when they recalled Sonia's first arrival. Sonia described how she had been afraid of Nikolai because he had cording on his jacket, and the nurse had told her that they would tie her up in cording too. "And I remember I was told you were found under a cabbage," said Natasha, "and I remember I didn't dare to disbelieve it then, though I knew it was untrue, and I felt so uncomfortable." During this conversation a maid popped her head in at the door leading into the divan room. "Miss, they've brought you a cock," she said in a whisper. "I don't want it, Polya. Tell them to take it away," said Natasha. In the middle of their talk in the divan room, Dimmler came into the room and went up to the harp that stood in the corner. He took off the cloth case, and the harp gave a jarring sound. "Edvard Karlich, do, please, play my favorite nocturne of Monsieur Field," said the voice of the old countess from the drawing-room. Dimmler struck a chord, and turning to Natasha, Nikolai, and Sonia, he said, "How quiet you young people are." "Yes, we're talking philosophy," said Natasha, looking round for a minute and going on with the conversation. They were talking now about dreams. Dimmler began to play. Natasha went noiselessly on tiptoe to the table, took the candle, carried it away, and going back, sat quietly in her place. It was dark in the room, especially where they were sitting on the sofa, but the silver light of the full moon shone in at the big windows and lay on the floor. "Do you know, I think," said Natasha in a whisper, moving up to Nikolai and Sonia when Dimmler had finished, and still sat, faintly twanging the strings, in evident uncertainty whether to leave off playing or begin something new, "that one goes on remembering and remembering. One remembers till one recalls what happened before one was in this world." "That's metempsychosis," said Sonia, who had been good at lessons and remembered all she had learned. "The Egyptians used to believe that our souls had been in animals and would go into animals again." "No, do you know, I don't believe that we were once in animals," said Natasha, still in the same whisper, though the music was over. "But I know for certain that we were once angels somewhere beyond, and we have been here, and that's why we remember everything." "May I join you?" said Dimmler, coming up quietly, and he sat down by them. "If we had been angels, why should we have fallen lower?" said Nikolai. "No, that can't be." "Not lower? Who told you we were lower?" "This is how I know I have existed before," Natasha replied with conviction. "The soul is immortal, you know. So, if I am to live forever, I have lived before, too. I have lived for all eternity." "Yes, but it's hard for us to conceive of eternity," said Dimmler, who had joined the young people with a mildly condescending smile, but now talked as quietly and seriously as they did. "Why is it hard to conceive of eternity?" said Natasha. "There will be today, and there will be tomorrow, and there will be forever, and yesterday has been, and the day before." "Natasha, now it's your turn. Sing me something." None of them, not even Dimmler, who was not young, wanted to break off the conversation and come out of the corner of the divan room, but Natasha stood up, and Nikolai sat down to the clavichord. Standing, as she always did, in the middle of the room, and choosing the place where the resonance was greatest, Natasha began singing her mother's favorite song. She had said she did not want to sing, but it was long since she had sung, and long before she sang again as she sang that evening. Count Ilya Andreich listened to her singing from his study, where he was talking to Mitenka, and like a schoolboy in haste to finish his lesson and run out to play, he blundered in his orders to the steward, and at last paused, and Mitenka stood silent and smiling before him, listening too. Nikolai never took his eyes off his sister, and drew his breath when she did. Sonia, as she listened, thought of the vast difference between her and her friend, and how impossible it was for her to be in ever so slight a degree fascinating like her cousin. The old countess sat with a blissful but mournful smile, and tears in her eyes, and now and then she shook her head. She too was thinking of Natasha and of her own youth, and of how there was something terrible and unnatural in Natasha's marrying Prince Andrei. Dimmler, sitting by the countess, listened with closed eyes. "No, Countess," he said at last, "that's a European talent. She has no need of teaching. That softness, tenderness, strength." "Ah, I'm afraid for her. I'm afraid," said the Countess, not remembering with whom she was speaking. Her motherly instinct told her that there was too much of something in Natasha, and that it would prevent her being happy. Natasha had not finished singing when 14-year-old Petya ran in great excitement into the room to announce the arrival of the mummers. Natasha stopped abruptly. "Idiot!" she screamed at her brother. She ran to a chair, sank into it, and broke into such violent sobbing that it was a long while before she could stop. "It's nothing, Mamma. It's nothing really. It's all right. Petya startled me," she said, trying to smile, but the tears still flowed, and the sobs still choked her. The mummers, house serfs, dressed up as bears, Turks, tavern keepers, and ladies, awe-inspiring or comic figures, at first huddled shyly together in the vestibule, bringing in with them the freshness of the cold outside and a feeling of gaiety. Then, hiding behind one another, they crowded together in the big hall, and at first with constraint, but afterwards with more liveliness and unanimity, they started singing songs, and performing dances, and songs with dancing, and playing Christmas games. The Countess, after identifying them and laughing at their costumes, went away to the drawing-room. Count Ilya Andreich sat with a beaming smile in the big hall, praising their performances. The young people had disappeared. Half an hour later there appeared in the hall among the other mummers an old lady in a crinoline. This was Nikolai. Petya was a Turkish lady, Dimmler was a clown, Natasha a hussar, and Sonia a Circassian with eyebrows and moustaches smudged with burnt cork. After those of the household who were not dressed up had expressed condescending wonder and approval, and had failed to recognize them, the young people began to think their costumes so good that they must display them to someone else. Nikolai, who wanted to drive them all in his sledge, as the road was in capital condition, proposed to drive to their so-called uncles, taking about a dozen of the house serfs in their mummer dress with them. "No, why should you disturb the old fellow?" said the Countess. "Besides, you wouldn't have room to turn round there. If you must go, let it be to the Melyukovs." Madame Melyukov was a widow with a family of children of various ages, and a number of tutors and governesses living in her house 4 versts from the Rostovs. "That's a good idea, my love," the old Count assented, beginning to be aroused. "Only let me dress up and I'll go with you. I'll make Pashette open her eyes." But the Countess would not agree to the Count's going. For several days he had had a bad leg. It was decided that the Count must not go, but that if Louisa Ivanovna, Madame Schoss, would go with them, the young ladies might go to Madame Melyukov's. Sonia, usually so shy and reticent, was more urgent than any in persuading Louisa Ivanovna not to refuse. Sonia's disguise was the best of all. Her moustaches and eyebrows were extraordinarily becoming to her. Everyone told her she looked very pretty, and she was in a mood of eager energy unlike her. Some inner voice told her that now or never her fate would be sealed, and in her masculine attire she seemed quite another person. Louisa Ivanovna consented to go, and half an hour later 4 sledges with bells drove up to the steps, their runners crunching with a clanging sound over the frozen snow. Natasha was foremost in setting the note-tone of holiday gaiety, and that gaiety, reflected from one to another, grew wilder and wilder, and reached its climax when they all went out into the frost, and talking and calling to one another, laughing and shouting, got into the sledges. 2 of the sledges were the common household sledges. The third was the old Count's, with a trotting horse from Orlov's famous stud. The fourth, Nikolai's own, with his own short, shaggy, raven horse in the shafts. Nikolai, in his old lady's crinoline and a hussar's cloak belted over it, stood up in the middle of the sledge, picking up the reins. It was so light that he could see the metal discs of the harness shining in the moonlight, and the eyes of the horses looking round in alarm at the noise made by the party under the portico of the approach. Sonia, Natasha, Madame Schoss, and 2 maids got into Nikolai's sledge. In the Count's sledge were Dimmler with his wife and Petya. The other mummers were seated in the other 2 sledges. "You go on ahead, Zahar," shouted Nikolai to his father's coachman, so as to have a chance of overtaking him on the road. The Count's sledge, with Dimmler and the others of his party, started forward, its runners creaking as though they were frozen to the snow, and the deep-toned bell clanging. The trace horses pressed close to the shafts, and sticking in the snow, kicked it up, hard and glittering as sugar. Nikolai followed the first sledge. Behind him he heard the noise and crunch of the other 2. At first they drove at a slow trot along the narrow road. As they drove by the garden, the shadows of the leafless trees often lay right across the road and hid the bright moonlight. But as soon as they were out of their grounds, the snowy plain, glittering like diamond with bluish lights in it, lay stretched out on all sides, all motionless and bathed in moonlight. Now and again a hole gave the first sledge a jolt. The next was jolted in just the same way, and the next, and the sledges followed one another, rudely breaking the iron-bound stillness. "A hare's track, a lot of tracks," Natasha's voice rang out in the frost-bound air. "How light it is, Nikolenka," said the voice of Sonia. Nikolai looked round at Sonia, and bent down to look at her face closer. It was a quite new, charming face, with black moustaches, and eyebrows that peeped up at him from the sable fur, so close, yet so distant, in the moonlight. That used to be Sonia, thought Nikolai. He looked closer at her and smiled. "What is it, Nikolenka?" "Nothing," he said, and turned to his horses again. As they came out on the trodden high road, polished by sledge runners, and all cut up by the tracks of spiked horseshoes, visible in the snow in the moonlight, the horses of their own accord tugged at the reins and quickened their pace. The left trace horse, arching his head, pulled in jerks at his traces. The shaft horse swayed to and fro, pricking up his ears as though to ask, "Are we to begin, or is it too soon?" Zachar's sledge could be distinctly seen, black against the white snow, a long way ahead now, and its deep-toned bell seemed to be getting further away. They could hear shouts and laughter and talk from his sledge. "Now then, my darlings," shouted Nikolai, pulling a rein on one side and moving his whip hand. It was only from the wind seeming to blow more freely in their faces, and from the tugging of the pulling trace horses, quickening their trot, that they saw how fast the sledge was flying along. Nikolai looked behind. The other sledges, with crunching runners, with shouts and cracking of whips, were hurrying after them. Their shaft horse was moving vigorously under the yoke, with no sign of slackening, and every token of being ready to go faster and faster if required. Nikolai overtook the first sledge. They drove down a hill and into a wide, trodden road by a meadow near a river. "Where are we?" Nikolai wondered. "Possibly Koskoye Meadow, I suppose. But no, this is something new I never saw before. This is not the Koskoye Meadow, or Demkin Hill. It's something... there's no knowing what." It's something new and fairy-like. Well, come what may." And shouting to his horses, he began to drive by the first sledge. Zakhar pulled up his horses and turned his face, which was white with hoarfrost, to the eyebrows. Nikolai let his horses go. Zakhar, stretching his hands forward, urged his on. "Come, hold on, master," said he. The sledges dashed along side by side, even more swiftly, and the horses' hooves flew up and down more and more quickly. Nikolai began to get ahead. Zakhar, still keeping his hands stretched forward, raised one hand with the reins. "Nonsense, master," he shouted. Nikolai put his 3 horses into a gallop and outstripped Zakhar. The horses scattered the fine dry snow in their faces. Close by, they heard the ringing of the bells and the horses' legs moving rapidly out of step, and they saw the shadows of the sledge behind. From different sides came the crunch of runners over the snow and the shrieks of girls. Stopping his horses again, Nikolai looked round him. All around him lay still the same enchanted plain, bathed in moonlight, with stars scattered over its surface. "Zakhar's shouting that I'm to turn to the left. But why to the left?" thought Nikolai. "Are we really going to the Melyukovs? Is this really Melyukovka? God knows where we are going, and God knows what is going to become of us. And very strange and nice it is, what is happening to us." He looked round in the sledge. "Look, his moustache and his eyelashes are all white," said one of the strange, pretty, unfamiliar figures sitting by him, with fine moustaches and eyebrows. "I believe that was Natasha," thought Nikolai, "and that was Madame Schoss. But perhaps it's not so. And that Circassian with the moustaches I don't know, but I love her." "Aren't you cold?" he asked them. They laughed and did not answer. Dimmler from the sledge behind shouted, probably something funny, but they could not make out what he said. "Yes, yes," voices answered, laughing. But now came a sort of enchanted forest with shifting black shadows, and the glitter of diamonds, and a flight of marble steps, and silver roofs of enchanted buildings, and the shrill whine of some beasts. And if it really is Melyukovka, then it's stranger than ever that after driving God knows where, we should come to Melyukovka, thought Nikolai. It certainly was Melyukovka, and footmen and maid-servants were running out with lights and beaming faces. "Who is it?" was asked from the entrance. "The mummers from the Count's. I can see by the horses," answered voices. Chapter 11. Pelageya Danilovna Melyukov, a broad-shouldered, energetic woman in spectacles and a loose house dress, was sitting in her drawing-room, surrounded by her daughters, and doing her utmost to keep them amused. They were quietly occupied in dropping melted wax into water, and watching the shadows of the shapes it assumed, when they heard the noise of steps in the vestibule, and the voices of people arriving. The hussars, fine ladies, witches, clowns, and bears, coughing and rubbing the hoarfrost off their faces, came into the hall, where they were hurriedly lighting candles. The clown, Dimmler, and the old lady, Nikolai, opened the dance. Surrounded by the shrieking children, the mummers hid their faces, and, disguising their voices, bowed to their hostess, and dispersed about the room. "Oh, there's no recognizing them. And Natasha, see what she looks like. Really, she reminds me of someone. How good Edvard Karlich is. I didn't know him. And how he dances. Oh, my goodness! And here's a Circassian, too, upon my word. How it suits Sonyushka. And who's this? Well, you have brought us some fun. Take away the tables, Nikita, Vanya. And we were sitting so quiet and dull. The hussar, just like a boy. And the legs? I can't look at him," voices cried. Natasha, the favorite of the young Melyukovs, disappeared with them into rooms at the back of the house, and burnt cork and various dressing gowns and masculine garments were sent for and taken from the footman by bare, girlish arms through the crack of the half-opened door. In 10 minutes all the younger members of the Melyukov family reappeared in fancy dress too. Pelageya Danilovna, busily giving orders for clearing the rooms for the guests and preparing for their entertainment, walked about among the mummers in her spectacles with a suppressed smile, looking close at them and not recognizing anyone. She not only failed to recognize the Rostovs and Dimmler, but did not even know her own daughters, or identify the masculine dressing gowns and uniform in which they were disguised. "And who is this?" she kept saying, addressing her governess and gazing into the face of her own daughter, disguised as a Tatar of Kazan. "One of the Rostovs, I fancy. And you, my hussar, what regiment are you in, pray?" she asked Natasha. "Give the Turk a preserved fruit," she said to the footman carrying round refreshments. "That's not forbidden by his law." Sometimes, looking at the strange and ludicrous capers cut by the dancers, who, having made up their minds once for all that no one recognized them, were quite free from shyness, Pelageya Danilovna hid her face in her handkerchief, and all her portly person shook with irrepressible, good-natured, elderly laughter. "My Sashinette, my Sashinette," she said. After Russian dances and songs in chorus, Pelageya Danilovna made all the party, servants and gentry alike, join in one large circle. They brought in a string, a ring, and a silver rouble, and began playing games. An hour later all the fancy dresses were crumpled and untidy. The corked moustaches and eyebrows were wearing off the heated, perspiring, and merry faces. Pelageya Danilovna began to recognize the mummers. She was enthusiastic over the cleverness of the dresses and the way they suited them, especially the young ladies, and thanked them all for giving them such good fun. The guests were invited into the drawing-room for supper, while the servants were regaled in the hall. "Oh, trying one's fate in the bath-house, that's awful," was said at the supper-table by an old maiden lady who lived with the Melyukovs. "Why so?" asked the eldest daughter of the Melyukovs. "Well, you won't go and try. It needs courage." "I'll go," said Sonia. "Tell us what happened to the young lady," said the second girl. "Well, it was like this," said the old maid. "The young lady went out. She took a cock, 2 knives and forks, and everything proper, and sat down. She sat a little while, and all of a sudden she hears someone coming. A sledge with bells driving up. She hears him coming. He walks in, precisely in the shape of a man like an officer, and sat down beside her in the place laid for him." "Ah! Ah!" screamed Natasha, rolling her eyes with horror. "But what did he do? Did he talk like a man?" "Yes, like a man. Everything as it should be, and began to try and win her over, and she should have kept him in talk till the cock crew. But she got frightened, simply took fright, and hid her face in her hands, and he caught her up. Luckily the maids ran in that minute." "Come, why are you scaring them?" said Pelageya Danilovna. "Why, Mamma, you tried your fate yourself," said her daughter. "And how do they try fate in a granary?" asked Sonia. "Why, at a time like this, they go to the granary and listen, and according to what you hear, if there's a knocking and a tapping, it's bad, but if there's a sound of sifting corn, it is good. But sometimes it happens—" "Mamma, tell us what happened to you in the granary." Pelageya Danilovna smiled. "Why, I have forgotten," she said. "I know none of you will go." "No, I'll go. Pelageya Danilovna, do let me, I'll go," said Sonia. "Oh, well, if you're not afraid." "Louisa Ivanovna, may I?" asked Sonia. Whether they were playing at the ring and string game, or the rouble game, or talking as now, Nikolai did not leave Sonia's side, and looked at her with quite new eyes. It seemed to him as though today, for the first time, he had, thanks to that corked moustache, seen her fully as she was. Sonia certainly was that evening gay, lively, and pretty, as Natasha had never seen her before. So, this is what she is, and what a fool I have been, he kept thinking, looking at her sparkling eyes, at the happy, ecstatic smile dimpling her cheeks under the moustache. He had never seen that smile before. "I'm not afraid of anything," said Sonia. "May I go at once?" She got up. They told Sonia where the granary was, how she was to stand quite silent and listen, and they gave her a cloak. She threw it over her head and glanced at Nikolai. "How exquisite that girl is," he thought. "And what have I been thinking about all this time?" Sonia went out into the corridor to go to the granary. Nikolai hastily went out to the front porch, saying he was too hot. It certainly was stuffy indoors from the crowd of people. Outside there was the same still frost, the same moonlight, only even brighter than before. The light was so bright, and there were so many stars sparkling in the snow, that the sky did not attract the eye, and the real stars were hardly noticeable. The sky was all blackness and dreariness, the earth all brightness. "I'm a fool, a fool. What have I been waiting for all this time?" thought Nikolai, and running out into the porch, he went round the corner of the house along the path leading to the back door. He knew Sonia would come that way. Halfway there was a pile of logs of wood, 7 feet long. It was covered with snow and cast a shadow. Across it, and on one side of it, there fell on the snow and the path a network of shadows from the bare old lime trees. The wall and roof of the granary glittered in the moonlight, as though hewn out of some precious stone. There was the sound of the snapping of wood in the garden, and all was perfect stillness again. The lungs seemed breathing in not air, but a sort of ever-youthful power and joy. From the maidservant's entrance came the tap of feet on the steps. There was a ringing crunch on the last step where the snow was heaped, and the voice of the old maid said, "Straight on, along this path, miss. Only don't look round." "I'm not afraid," answered Sonia's voice, and Sonia's little feet in their dancing shoes came with a ringing, crunching sound along the path towards Nikolai. Sonia was muffled up in the cloak. She was 2 paces away when she saw him. She saw him, too, not as she knew him, and as she was always a little afraid of him. He was in a woman's dress, with tousled hair, and a blissful smile that was new to Sonia. She ran quickly to him. Quite different, and still the same, thought Nikolai, looking at her face, all lighted up by the moon. He slipped his hands under the cloak that covered her head, embraced her, drew her to him, and kissed the lips that wore a moustache and smelt of burnt cork.